All right, hello. Welcome to the Friday seminar. I'm Callie Clifton. I'm a professor in civil engineering. I'm the instructor for the civil engineering section of the course. And Dr. Jenny Liu is in the back, and she's the instructor this term for the urban studies and planning sections. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Kristi Currans. She's a PhD student in civil engineering. She's working with me. And she's going to be presenting some of the work that she's been doing on her dissertation on ITE's trip generation manual. So I will turn it over to Kristi.
Okay. Well, hello. I am Kristi. I've been working with trip generation data for like 7 years now, or almost 7 years now. So I have kind of a weird perspective from it in that I'm basically digging into it and finding all the issues with it. And so what I wanted to do today, and this is part of my dissertation and part of all the work that I've been doing with Dr. Clifton along the way, is to sort of provide a hodgepodge of things I've learned that I know aren't necessarily out there in the field in a way that you as the viewers out there will be able to get to know ITE a little bit more intimately. If I knew how to attach music to a PowerPoint, I would be playing the King and I Getting to Know You song in the background. So just have that in the back of your mind throughout this presentation, and you'll get the right vibe. The longer title for this presentation comes from the title of a paper from my dissertation, and it's really about understanding the assumptions, sensitivities, uncertainty, and what it means to be conservative when you're using ITE's trip generation data in the land development process. So to start, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what traffic impact analyses or traffic impact studies are, and then I'm going to get into detail in some unique aspects of these data that some people I don't believe really know when they're using it. And the whole purpose of this is to really provide a better sense of judgment for the user. And that's really the purpose of this entire paper and what I'd like to do, bringing all these weird little facts together for people, is that people are generally, across the U.S., ubiquitously using this data without a really good understanding of what it is. And part of that is because ITE doesn't keep very transparent records of what the data are, and part of it is because they haven't really thought to look into it. And so that's really what I'd like to do, and what I'd like to consider is that if you are an agency or a practitioner who are applying these data, I want you to just to think a little bit more about the things that I talk about today and your own ideas to make sure that you're applying the best sense of judgment when you're using them. So what is a traffic impact analysis? Well, it's actually a broad term that could be used for a lot of different things, or a really specific term for one specific process in the land development process. Generally, when we say traffic or transportation impact study or analyses, we're talking about a capacity analysis where when new development is going in, we're evaluating the transportation impacts, mostly just the vehicle transportation impacts of that development on the network. But it can also be used to get an idea of what sort of mitigations need to happen in order to accommodate growth, for example. You may incorporate a safety study within it to make sure that the additional transportation isn't causing a problem for the access of that site, for example. Some larger developments may have environmental or health impact studies that are attached to them to understand what the other consequences of that development, or maybe benefits of that development. And so it's really a broad range of things. And under all of these different things is this ITE trip generation data. It's really used consistently across the U.S., with the exception of New York City and San Francisco, to accommodate these estimations. So it's widely used. On the right is what it looks like. So you may have seen it. I thought about bringing it in, but I didn't want to carry it around. It's a 3-volume, 2 different books, part of it. But what we're basically doing is we're saying, for this new development, how many cars or how many people are you adding to the network? And then we're doing, use the mouse here, maybe, some sort of impact assessment to understand anything from queuing, whether you may need a turning bay, and these are really engineering methods that are used to understand the capacity and what the impacts are. On the right is an example of these data. They're really kind of a simple They provide them in a simple way. They're papers, so it's a book you flip, and this is page, I don't know, 784 for shopping center. What you have is a univariate rate, which means that what you're predicting the outcome on the y side is vehicle trips, and what you're using is the size of the development. So you're using one variate for the entire thing. Historically, they're only using vehicle trip counts, so the majority of the data provided in this manual that is often required by agencies to be used is only vehicle data. It's mainly counted for in suburban context, so it's not necessarily urban data. There are new editions of this practice where they're trying to incorporate this new data, and we're going to talk a little bit about the problems and the limitations of this new data. But it's mainly vehicle data, and that's an important thing to keep in your mind. So for this presentation, most of what I'm going to talk to you about is the data that everybody seems to be using. So it's not necessarily the new data, which is really interesting, and there are a lot of presentations, and I think some presentations are archived from the Friday Transportation Seminar. But really, I'm just going to focus on this older data, because this older data is what people in smaller jurisdictions are required to use. The problem with these data is, in part because they're suburban only. What we're seeing is that these data tend to overestimate the amount of vehicle traffic at urban locations. So in this example, I believe we're looking at convenience markets. ITE's handbook, which are the black estimates there, are over-predicting the traffic at these urban locations by about 100%. And a simple urban adjustment, which is what you see circled in green down below, can accommodate these differences. And when you see these big differences in the estimation, these large errors, that trickles through the development process, and it requires the developer to overcompensate for vehicle traffic. You may charge the developer 100% more for the vehicle traffic than you normally would. It could inhibit development. It could inhibit density and growth. So what we really want to see, what the outcome of this is, we want to have some accurate sense of what the demand is at these locations. And that's really the ultimate goal, that we're trying to provide an accurate estimate. And there are lots of problems with this data, and we're not going to go through every little one. We're just going to cover a couple of these today. And today we're going to start with the age of the data, which is rarely discussed. It's actually commonly understood that ITE doesn't throw anything out. There's only one exception to that, which I'll mention later. But I got access to the data, and this is just a simple distribution of the age of data that's widely used across the U.S. This actually only represents about 97% of the data. There's another 3% that's before 1950. So there's actually data older than, I don't know, the suburbs in this data set. And the average age is 1985, which I found really interesting because I am slightly younger than the average age of this data. So when we're evaluating transportation impacts at places in downtown Portland, we're using data that's older than I am in order to assess those impacts. But there are other things that we could look at, landmarks that happen through time that we could look at. Here are 3 examples of big recession hits to our economy. Now, there's nothing in these methods that control for changes in the economy. Fuel prices have changed quite a bit in the past 50 or 60 years, and yet we don't accommodate that or control for that at all. Another example is how we fund our transportation network and how we evaluate it has changed. Federal Highway Act in the 56. Following, this is when we started seeing a lot of the interstates being developed. 2005 Intermodal Surface Transportation Act, where federally we started paying attention to multimodal funding, multimodal facilities, and yet most of the data falls between those two things, those two acts. There have been a number of changes to the transportation opportunities that you could take. Here are several of them. In '84, we saw the Chrysler minivan come on the market. The 1990s, the internet became widely used. I think 2005, 2007 were really interesting because Google Transit came out in 2005, and by 2007 it was incorporated into Google Maps. 2007. Okay. Are you sure it's not just my phone? Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Ah. So we've seen a shift in the modes that are even available for users, and yet we're not accommodating this. We're still only looking at vehicle trips. We're still focusing on suburban development, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And we're not changing the way that we're thinking about this. We're not accommodating all these new things that we're seeing. The modern light rail. So light rail was there before 1981. We started seeing modern light rail come in 81, modern streetcar in 2001. Those things are really ignored in these data. Another thing that happened is all the changes in land use that we've seen and the way that people interact with land use. In 1956, we have the first fully enclosed mall in the U.S. opens. By the 1990s, we were seeing about 140 malls open every year in the U.S. In 1987, Starbucks, which had been founded in the 70s, was sold to Schultz. Schultz is the person who really turned that into the franchise that you see today. We're not really considering changes into these coffee shops and things like that. In 1992, point-of-sale technology, that's the warehousing, manufacturing technology that's used in land uses like Walmart, which has completely changed the way that we think about warehousing, and yet we still keep warehousing data from before 1992. Some of the really old data from the 20s and 30s is warehousing data. In 1994, Amazon.com was founded. If I was a betting gal, I would put all my money on retail being the number one thing that's changed the most of all these land uses. And it really has to do with the internet and Amazon.com. And yet, we don't control for that. We don't consider that in keeping these data or throwing them away. In the 2000s, fast fashion, which is the type of retailing industry mainly used for places like Zara and H&M. It's really high turnover fashion. It's very different than the old department stores, which deliver their goods quarterly. What that means is that consumers tend to come more frequently than they do in department stores, and yet that data, it falls under the same category. 2007 was the first year in 50 years that no new malls were built in the U.S. So in the 1990s, we were seeing about 140 a year open in the U.S., and now very few open. Many are closing their doors for good. And yet we're still keeping the data that was collected at these locations and not really fully understanding where that as a land use is going in the future. Right. So I think this is probably one of the more interesting graphics that came out of this work, because we really don't know the age of the data. And the argument that ITE often makes is that, well, the age doesn't matter. But I've given you a number of landmarks here, some things to think about, and that a lot has changed in 50 and 60 years, and we're not throwing any of that data out. In the UK, their trip generation sort of approach throws out data that's 10 years old or older. So they only keep things that were collected within a decade. If we were to do that, we would only have 4% of this data. And there's actually 8% of this data that was collected before 1970. So the distribution, the way that we're holding on to things that we have no idea how well they represent today could actually be harming the way that we're looking at development. And I'll get into that in one of these next little hodgepodge slides. So moving from age of data into location info, what we know from a lot of the research that exists today about this is that the urban form and the built environment really do influence what we observe on the site. And what we have with ITE's trip generation data is really a large data set of very suburban-oriented locations. And what this means is that what we're doing is collecting and compiling this suburban data and trying to say that it's exactly the same thing or it fits into this urban location. And what we know from a lot of our research in the past decade is that's absolutely not true and sometimes can completely provide counterintuitive results. But part of the problem is that ITE doesn't provide a transparent sense of what the data look like. We have no idea about site-level attributes that really can cause a lot of variation in the data. We have no idea what the parking is at any of those locations. We are supposed to assume that all locations in ITE's manual have no bike, no ped, no transit, free and unconstrained parking, parking that's not shared with any other land uses, so every development is its own thing that you can constrain, and that's not even the case in a lot of suburban, like historic main streets where they might have a parking garage that's shared across an entire retail center or things like that. And without that information, we really don't understand what it is that we're looking at when we look at ITE. One issue that we're seeing, and this came out of an early paper for my dissertation, is that sociodemographics around the site, around the development, have large impacts in the transportation that we're observing on the site. Now, in travel behavior research, we've known this for a really long time, but travel behavior research is usually focused on the household's travel, not at the travel of the attractions at the developments. So what this is finding is that even controlling for accessibility, controlling for these aspects of the built environment, the demographics of the surrounding area are correlated or related to what we're seeing, and we don't think about demographics at all in the development review process. The anecdote I generally hear is that, well, by the time the development actually happens, the demographics probably change. That's usually the anecdote I hear. But the problem with that is that, well, the economy also changes and the density also changes. And so when you make that sort of assumption, because demographics are difficult to control for and you have to think through what it is you're controlling for, what we might be doing is restricting development in areas that have low income because you're overestimating the demand or vice versa. So thinking through what is it that impacts these trip rates is really important for this process. And because ITE doesn't generally provide the location information, that's a really hard thing to look at and to control for. So the location info is a widely studied topic, and I think there have been 12 major research studies. Most of them have tried to get at the built environment, and a few of them tried to get at demographics. But what we're seeing is that one consistent problem that happens across pretty much all 12 methods that are being developed is that we're still adjusting from ITE using a donation-based sampling. And what this means is that the data that's provided in ITE is provided through calls for data. So people, practitioners in practice, already have to do these studies and have to collect their own data for different reasons. They have problematic businesses, so the business is completely new. Pot stores were something that completely shook the industry because they didn't know what to do. They had to collect more data is what they had to do. Difficult locations, so when you're locating in areas where there's already traffic congestion, those are often triggering these impact studies, which then the data gets donated into ITE. I mentioned this before, but we're supposed to believe that every single site is mainly representing this suburban, little bike ped transit, sort of a worst case, low density development. But they also have a land use in there called high-rise residential, which does not seem like a suburban development to me. So it would be really useful to have that information but because they mask all these locations, we don't get that. The highest or the lowest level of context we get are these really general regions, Pacific, Central, Mountain, Eastern. But if you tell me that the data is in the Pacific, and therefore it should be representative of Portland, that could have been collected on the outskirts of Bend. It could be collected in the middle of San Francisco, Tacoma, anywhere in the Pacific region. So it doesn't actually help, is I guess the big thing. Newer data that's being collected, so I'm part of a national committee, and right now we're discussing how we should provide the context information. I'm pushing for open transparency, knowing where it falls in the block group or something like that, providing continuous measures of the built environment. What many of the practitioners are pulling for are really general categories, categorized often in a priori way. So if the donator says, oh, this is the urban core, then that's where the data falls. It's sort of it makes me cringe, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we're still debating this. This is something that if you are an ITE member or you feel very passionately about this, they are taking comments about this. So I encourage you to send a few emails their way. But the big thing here is that because this is donation-based sampling and because ITE masks where their data fall, there's really no way to understand what this is supposed to represent. We just have to make a lot of really big assumptions and hope that we're not too far off. The next thing I wanted to talk about is person trips, because we're actually moving to a more person trip oriented method. So instead of just focusing on cars, we want to focus on overall activity and the modes with which you travel. And that provides a little bit more flexibility. But there are some assumptions that we make when we're doing this. So in this first example, we have 3 contexts, and we're applying the state of the practice, which is ITE's vehicle trips. And even if a land use that's exactly the same size falls in each of these 3 contexts, what we're saying is the outcome should be the same for all 3 of these. The assumption that people are making then is when you're applying that same number of person trips for each of these 3 contexts, but because the context might have different built environment or urban form, you might see different mode shares. The assumption this is making is that the person trips remains the same. So you can take these suburban vehicle-oriented data and make some assumptions to calculate person trips and then carry that across the region. But this violates some assumptions that are often made in urban spatial structure theory and just common sense. Why would a restaurant locate downtown and pay all that extra money to locate downtown if you're generating the same amount of traffic as an exurban place? So it's not entirely intuitive how or where this assumption should be made, and so that's some of the other research that we're looking at. The way that this falls out into an example I'm going to show you is data that was collected from Portland, the metropolitan region, in, I think, 2012. It was Dr. Clifton's study. And I pulled restaurants in Portland and categorized them into 4 really general categories. So suburban, exurban, suburban downtowns are 2 types of suburban areas. Both technically fit into ITE's definition of suburban. But one thing you'll notice is the average person trip rates vary. And as you go further downtown, so interurban Portland's like southeast, northeast, downtowns, the central business district, you'll see again these person trip rates vary. You'll also notice that the vehicle trip rates decline. So this is what a lot of the state-of-the-art research projects, those 12 that I mentioned before, they've been working to find how this varies and what's the best way to control for it. But ITE's data would predict from this adjustment this dotted red line where all person trips for each of these contexts based on this assumption should fall on this dotted line. And as you'll see for restaurants in Portland, we found that actually it varies quite a bit, and ITE often underestimates the total amount of travel. And what this means is in areas like downtown, we're basically taking all of these pedestrians and pretending they don't exist. And so if we can get a better method that estimates overall activity and then also distributes them into modes, we'll have a better idea of how we're supposed to accommodate, or how many pedestrians, for example, we're supposed to accommodate in places like downtown, but also suburban downtowns. I think one of the more interesting things here is that, ITE says these are all suburban locations, we shouldn't see bikes and peds, but we shouldn't see bikes and peds is inaccurate to what we actually do see, that even in these exurban locations, we're seeing a lot of people walking and biking. The small transit mode share is really more an artifact of how we collected the data, so a lot of the pedestrians were also using transit in one way or another. But either way, suburban, exurban, we're still seeing people walk, so we shouldn't just automatically assume that there are no people walking there. Let's see. But this brings up a much broader point about adjustments to ITE. Because we don't really understand the context that ITE represents, and yet all of the available methods use ITE as an adjustment, or most of them, I shouldn't say all. There's actually one that does its own thing in sort of a beautiful little way. What we're seeing, one second, let me make sure I got this in the right hour. Yeah. What we're seeing is that this adjustment often underestimates the total amount of person trips. Now, office, I think, is interesting because it's the one example that I could find where it slightly overestimates person trips, which means that ITEs may be representing what you would expect to see, the adjustment to ITE, what would you expect to see in urban areas. So in this example, I use the mouse again. 0 represents the observed compared with the adjusted. So if you're below 0, and I have this nice little reference here, it indicates locations, observations where this adjustment actually overestimated person trips. If you're above 0, it says you're underestimated. And you'll notice that the range is about negative 50% to 50%. I'd like to point out that when we use these rates, we're often using 2 or 3 decimal points. So we're saying this land use generates 3.52 trips. And yet the adjustment is actually, plus or minus 50% for offices alone. So it's not really compatible with the level of precision that we think we're using. But so there's a lot of error here. If we go on to residential, you'll even see more error. So here we have it ranging from overestimating to about 70% to underestimating by about 400 or 350%. And this is even the worst one. If we look at service, some of the worst ones are underestimating person trips by 900%. And service generally implies restaurants and things like banks. So this is a lot of restaurant data with a few other types of services blown in. But what this is saying is that IT's data, which is super, super suburban, or at least we're assuming so, when we're adjusting it into urban locations, we're seeing that it's not actually an adequate comparison to the amount of activity we see at these land uses in urban areas. And services aren't even the worst ones. Retail actually has some of the worst performance rates when we're looking at converting ITE's vehicle trips, their suburban vehicle trips, to urban locations. I think these mainly include, some of the worst ones are convenience markets in Portland, which means that for whatever reason, these convenience markets are generating a really high number of trips. And the locations that ITE we're observing are probably less economically successful. But there's nothing in the methods that controls for economic success or potential of the neighborhoods. And so this continues to be a problem. So what this is saying is, for all of these land uses, except maybe office, we're basically ignoring a ton of people that are coming to those sites. And because they're urban locations, those people are generally coming by biking and walking and transit, but we're ignoring them. Right. So that brings us to another aspect of data collection protocols in it. At this point, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but this one is probably one of my favorite ones because transportation engineers often know that this is true and they understand what this means, but the agencies that apply them are often shocked when they hear this stuff. So the interesting thing, that's in the eye of the beholder, but the interesting thing to me about this data collection, this method, is that what we're actually capturing is called a moving sum. So here is an example of a residential building from Washington, D.C. that was collected. They did the data collection from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., so a 3-hour data collection. And then they computed a moving hourly sum. And this is standard in the practice. This is how you calculate your peak hour. This dotted line here in the middle would be your average peak hour. Right? This is what people think that they're thinking of when we talk about average peak hours. What we're actually talking about is this peak hour. It's the highest peak hour observed during your study period. And it's actually a maximum. So when we talk about average peak hour rates, we really should be saying average maximum peak hour rates. And there's very little discussed in that 1,000, 2,000 page volume. This is identified in one footnote on the data collection form. It's not explored. So I thought I would explore it a little bit. I call this the inflation because transportation engineers, really wonky people who get into the really specifics of this process, want to make sure that the facility doesn't fail at the worst case. So they're making this assumption, this sort of, it's not so much an assumption, but they're making this decision without really explicitly explaining what this inflation is. So I call this inflation, right? In this example, I have housing on the left, which was collected in Washington, D.C., and retail and service, which was collected in Portland, Oregon. And I'm using these two data sets because they're the only ones I could find that has the 15-minute increments. Usually you summarize it using this average maximum, you submit it, and that's what everybody uses to do their research. So in these cases, I'm actually looking at those moving sum averages and the differences between that average definition, if we go back here, the average definition and the maximum that are used in all of ITE's methods. And I'm comparing the difference between the maximum ITE's definition with the average observed rate. And so 0, that red dotted line, means no difference. And for all examples, we see an inflation of what we're defining as our maximum average. And this inflation varies from 4% to 60% for these two land uses, which means that the data that we're using is 4 to 60% higher than the average, the actual average peak hour. The average of all of this error, of all this inflation, is 20 to 25%, which means that if you're using the average peak hour as defined by ITE, that's going to be an on average of 20 to 25% higher than a true average of averages. Okay. But even when we look at the variability of peak hour for given land use over time, we see that there's a ton of variability in just what we're observing anyway. So here are some examples from convenience markets in Portland. These are transaction counts. This picture on the left is a very colorful scatter diagram of all of the observations for 90 sites collected over the course of a week. So it's a lot of variation. Through a series of cluster analyses and fancy statistical techniques, I found that there were really 5 different patterns for these convenience markets, and they fall into 2 categories. The first is your traditional peak hour, where you see a lump in the AM and a lump in the PM. But even within that category, there's actually 3 different levels, where some are much higher and much steeper than others. And then I also found a set of 2 peak hour types of land uses that really peaked during lunchtime. These are places that were close to economic centers and employees and stuff like that. And these are all from the same land use, the same business, same marketing, same cost and price. So it's controlling for a number of things, but it's spread across the region. And when we consider ITE's data, what we're really saying is that for any one land use, they provide you what the peak hours are, and we're assuming that they're all the same. But actually, even the distribution of activity varies quite a bit within the same land use in the same region, and so on. And that's not even considering the modal aspect. So this is from research back in, I think, 2013. There's a link down here. It indicates the distribution of mode-specific trips over time for one region. And you'll see that whacking is this yellow hump here in the midday. So when we collect this data, even when we're thinking more multimodally, we're taking our vehicle trip methods that were developed, in the 50s and 60s and so on, and we're just trying to extend them to bike and peds. And when no pedestrians come 4 to 6 p.m., we're saying, oh, there's no pedestrian traffic. But realistically, we may be missing all of it and not requiring accommodations or even considering them because we're just looking at the wrong peak for that mode. So that's just a point that I wanted to bring out there because I think it's really telling, and I would love bringing it up in conversations with the National Committee because they kind of hate it. So all of this sort of comes together in the land development review process, and the one sort of, I think this might be the final point. We'll see if this is the final point. My point that I wanted to make with this is that when we're doing these predictions, we're often predicting the average, and we're carrying that average, which is 2 to 3 decimal points, and we're carrying it through this process. But in a lot of my research, what I'm seeing is really broad error bands. So this is some convenience market data where I developed this method, and then I used it and did some bootstrapping to come up with some confidence intervals. And in this example, what we might be doing in practice is taking a land use and estimating about 550 vehicle trips for a given time period. But what this confidence interval band, so a 95% confidence interval, means that realistically this site could see anything from 350 to about 1250 counts during that same time period. But we're carrying through the 550 counts through that process. But then you notice that the 550 counts warrant some mitigation. So it could be a street widening. It could be something that triggers an improvement at an intersection. And what we think when we're using these average rates is that means that there's a 50% chance that this would fail and a 50% chance that it wouldn't. But we know that this is the average maximum count, which is 20 to 25% higher on average than the average of averages. So realistically, this isn't a 50-50 chance that it would fail. It might be like a 65-35% chance that it would fail. And then we realized that, oh, this data was collected in suburban locations, and this is actually an urban location, so that 65 to 35 is actually closer to 80-20 at this rate. And then you realize that, oh, you're only looking at the peak hour, but that's, 8% of your entire day. So the point here is that there's a lot of variation. We're making a lot of assumptions that that all applications should be representing suburban locations, and that we need to have this sort of worst case of worst case of worst case. But we're calling it an average throughout this whole process. And this is where the rest of my research really sort of leaps off, thinking about how do we accommodate this uncertainty, how do we better control for these assumptions that we're making so that it's more sensitive to where you're actually estimating and what those plans are you have for that location. And how do we make decisions that don't force development into undue consequences, or pretend like they're not generating hundreds of pedestrian trips when they actually are, and then providing some method for accommodation there. So there are a number of mechanisms for change, and I'm just going to walk through a few of them so I don't cause people to panic, because I know that's probably what you're all thinking about at this point. One thing that I think would be probably the most useful is just to have more stakeholder involvement. A lot of the decisions that are made when we're developing ITE's processes are really done with a round table full of transportation engineers that have been in the business for 50 years. So they're not agencies, they're not researchers, they're often not the developers, they're not thinking about who they want to come to the site and what the planning of that is. They're engineers, right? So the people defining the problem should probably not be the people who are also solving the problem. They should have a hand in that. They should have a seat at the table too. But I'm always kind of surprised at how few agencies get a say in what gets collected and what these protocols, these decisions are. And so part of this process, I think, is really just keeping ITE in some sort of loop or collaboration with universities who are interested in doing the research and can maybe help provide innovative methods, and then cities who are really dealing with this data and having all these issues that they're seeing on the ground floor. I also believe that there is a huge discrepancy in the amount of investment in this data. It is probably the most widely used data set in the U.S., and yet it is also the least evolved method of transportation demand estimation. And I think this is because when you have this database that goes back 60 years and you're not going to get rid of anything, then there's no reason to collect anything more. So if we were just to say that everything that's 10 years or older gets thrown away and what we're left with is 4% of the data, then we might see some more investment in this and willingness to use different types of data collection technology too. And then I also think that there's something that I just love thinking about a lot is just what data really are, and just being curious about the things that you're using and how you're using them, and these assumptions that you're making that you're not even really thinking about. The assumption for highest peak hour, I think, is the greatest example of this, because it really is, of all these documents, I mean, I went back into all the old editions and I tried to find where they made that decision to take this highest peak hour instead of the average, just to understand what they knew when they made that decision. And there was nothing. It is just a footnote on a data collection form, and that's it. And if we're making these decisions, somebody along the way should at least stop and look into them. And without that, we don't have good engineering judgment when we apply them, or planning judgment if you're a planner, or agency judgment if you're an agency, whatever. So I think there's something about this type of research that I just love, is that you're just trying to ask, well, what is it that this is trying to represent, and how far from that goal are you in real life? So I wanted to thank, I've gotten a ton of funding and support over the years from the Eisenhower federal grant, from the FHWA, from Portland State, my advisor, Dr. Clifton. I've been on, most of my projects have been her projects, I think. And then from NITSE, I got the graduate fellowship, which has really allowed me this past year to almost finish my research and graduate. So I wanted to thank everybody for all of this great trip-gen research, which I know you're all just thrilled about. You're welcome. And ask for questions. Yeah. Oh, so the protocols of when you pick a site are supposed to control for influences of flooding and fires and things like that, because what they're trying to represent is some average level of impact for that region. So it's not something that would be easy to look at. Ideally, we want to control for that. So we don't want to study a restaurant in a coastal town right after a tsunami, for example. And that definitely, when you read research studies, those decisions are influenced when you think about, when you look at how people thought about how they picked a site. But there's no way to really know what those impacts are because there's very little transparency there.
For regions that have like a possibility of disasters for future planning, and
well, this is not the data where they would collect that, I guess is the point. That this is not the arena in which they would think about that. You want to control for as much of that as you can in selecting your site, but you wouldn't have that information, or you don't currently have that information. Yeah.
That's up to 10 years old. Did you look at like the analog to the trip generation manual in other countries to see how they were doing it?
A little bit in some of our other work, we did some reviews of all the methods that are out that for not every country goes through development review quite like we do. Australia is probably the closest. They actually use a lot of our data, which is kind of odd in a certain way. Trix is the UK, so it includes Northern Ireland. It's a private firm, and so they are subscription-based, and then they use that subscription to consistently update their data, look at specific questions. So if a user is really concerned about the impact of transit stations or light rail, they can, develop a study and add a chapter, which is, I think, the right. If you're going to do this, doing it subscription based, where you can control how your site selection works, is more ideal. And then New Zealand also has one, and they've done something similar to Australia, where they're trying to develop their own database, but it's really expensive. Each one of those data points costs $8,000 to $10,000 to collect, and that includes the process of picking the site and that sort of thing. If you're talking about mixed-use developments, really large developments, that each data point is more like $50,000, so it gets really expensive. But New Zealand uses ITE, supplementing with their own data, with their own sort of planning problems, and modifies it for their own country. But otherwise, other countries just they assess development differently and through different processes. So not every country goes through this process. That makes sense. And I think you could take one of Kelly Clifton's classes if you would like to learn more about that. Yeah.
I was in Portugal last year, and they used the ITE data not just for land use impacts, but also when they're doing their four-step modeling as a way to estimate trip attractions. So these errors then, our errors get propagated all over the world.
And these data are also used in California's Cal EE mod as a way of estimating scale, and then they apply a trip length factor to get VMT. So they're incorporated in lots of models that I don't even think. Somebody told me once that some water resource people use them as well for some reason, and I have never found that, but I think they get used without really being thought about a lot. Yeah?
I'm curious, sort of building off on the last question, how much of this so this is a really good critique, I think, of ITE's trip generation method, and I'm curious to know to what degree cities still enforce the use of it, and how much of it, if you know, still affects design, even, something like street design, streetscaping.
Yeah. So two parts to that question. There are only 2 reviews of practice that I know of, and both the requirements and the guidelines for different agencies is put out there in different ways, and sometimes it's not even made public, mostly just because it's small agencies, websites, HTML. But both of them found that with the exception of New York, San Francisco, the rest of them pretty much say you got to use ITE. A few of them even say you have to use the 7th edition of ITE, which means that even if ITE is willing to incorporate innovation, which they have been, the 3rd edition of the handbook and the 4th coming out later this year, incorporates all the research that we've been doing in other places. They're still confining their practitioners to an older set of the data. So even if they improve, the developers, the practitioners can't use something else. And one anecdote that I often hear is that we're pushing for this, and we've been pushing for this for a while, and practitioners will say, well, this is all great, but legally I can't use this, or legally there's no precedent for this. And so if it's not incorporated into the handbook, so it would be, you could throw away the handbook, but if it's not incorporated into it, then there are lots of places where if you don't use that, you risk getting sued because there's no precedent. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't entirely understand all of the reasons why this still sounds representative to a lot of people, but it definitely does play into a lot of the site design decisions, especially if you're consistently overestimating vehicle trips. And it might be that you're consistently overestimating it for 20% across the city, but if every development is overestimating it, what you see is this pernicious and incremental effect where people are like, oh, but it's one development, oh, but it's one development, but it's all of the one developments building off of each other. And there's a great article by Michael Manville, I want to say, in JTLU that looks specifically about the historical decisions of LA's street widening. And these data really come into play there. He talks about the interactions between planners and engineers and how planners feel, well, this isn't our data, we don't have the say to change this, and engineers say, well, planners haven't given us a different metric, so we can't change it, so it's that disconnect. It sort of complements your question. Yeah.
It's often considered the industry standard and a professional standard, and then that becomes a very hard thing to
And there are lots of practitioners out there that don't understand the value of it, that they don't understand. It's supposed to be a rule of thumb. It's supposed to be easy for them. But what's easy for them makes it really hard to create livable communities that meet the regional plans.
this limits density.
No, and I was kind of, I wasn't sure. So this is the forefront of state-of-the-art research, but that just really means that I haven't had time to really think about how to describe it. But one thing we're noticing some examples of is that proposed development, and this is showing my Photoshop skills, a proposed development is often scaled back from what is desired, so it's much smaller because of the way in which these data trickle through the review process. There's one example of a development in Clackamas County called, I think, Eagle Landing, where the developer has this vision for 2.1 million square feet of development, a whole community, high density, all this innovative stuff. He's got the layout and all of that. He can only develop about 700,000, so about a third of it, because they're using these data that are problematic. They're only looking at vehicle trips. They're not looking at mode shares and economic growth that it brings in and all these things. And what's happening is the development is capped at a certain level so that one intersection won't fail, even though the data tend to overestimate vehicle trips anyway. So it's capped from the desired, and then on top of that, the county wants it. They want higher densities there. They may not want 2.1 million square feet. That, I don't know. But it's zoned for it. And so there's a discrepancy between what's zoned in the land use and then what their, intersection plans are and how they're improving the facilities on that level. And so we are seeing that happen, and it probably is happening only in locations where there's a demand for it economically, where, there's a reason why developers want to invest in those areas. So we don't really know how much that trickles through the process or where that doesn't happen, but yeah. Amanda?
Amanda Howell. You mentioned that you are pushing for the information at the block group level, ideally, but that there's this pushback to have more of a place type categorization.
Yeah.
What's the reasoning for that, and like why is it masked?
Oh, yeah. So I think the biggest reason is for research, is for doing more of this, where we're understanding what we're looking at and perhaps identifying what's not represented in the database. The thing that is really useful for practitioners who are thinking, or agencies who are thinking really progressively about this, so DC is a great example, they have a lot of really interesting things going, is they know what their place types are, and ITE confining them means that all urban cores are supposedly the same, but urban core Bend, Oregon is not going to be urban core DC. And so providing block group or continuous, more refined measures allow agencies to sort of set those constraints on what data in there you can use for their land, for their place types. Yeah. Jenny?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of do a combination of some questions that are from our online viewers. So this is kind of a combination of questions from Reza Lou and Rachel Knight online. So they were wondering whether there were any, in the places where ITE usage is mandated, whether there are any capacities or abilities to adjust the ITE trip gen rates in terms of density or other characteristics that might be different.
Sometimes and sometimes not. That's more information that's really not always spelled out clearly online, so it's really difficult to get practitioners to tell you what their rules are. And sometimes their rules are just internally, we don't allow a reduction more than 10 or 15% for pedestrian travel, even in areas within their own area where you can observe 30 or 40% pedestrian traffic. So often what happens is agencies just don't want to be manipulated by developers who understand the data or practitioners who understand the data. And so they'll just say, well, no more than 10%, no more than 20%. But those often aren't backed by any real data analysis. They're just sort of internal. They're probably a little bit political, too. And some agencies are much better about that. San Francisco has sort of a zoned or a district-wide mode shares that they calculate so that they sort of come up with those rates so that when you're going in, you know exactly what you're going to be charged or what your rate is for different areas. So some agencies are better, but those are typically ones with more money and more problems, so they have more reason to support that.
I think what's so striking about this is everybody loses. Developers lose, cities lose, counties lose, and it's surprising that there isn't more of a push to get this better data. Has anyone tried to quantify the financial impact of just, lost development and things like that? It might be easier to get people to work together if they had a dollar analysis of this stuff.
Not yet. And partly because it's there's a lot that happens in this process that isn't regulated specifically by guidelines. There's a lot of negotiations that happen, a lot of other conversations that change things throughout the process, and so that's hard. I think you would almost have to get to know what those processes are more in a wider study before you could maybe simulate what those impacts are. But yeah, it seems completely counterintuitive because often you have people sitting around the table who both want the same thing, but the developer is not going to want to pay any more than the minimum that they have to, and the agency wants to make sure that they're not stunting development, but also that they're collecting the funds to be able to improve the facilities they need to. But yeah, I think you're right.
Traffic impact analysis or the traffic impact analysis. So when I was in Texas, I did a lot of these while I was working on my PhD, and the developer hires the consultant to do the study. That was how it was in Austin. That's how it is here. But in San Antonio, the consultants really work for the public agency, and they're kind of like on call, like public defenders, and they get randomly selected. So what happens is if the consultant is working directly for the developer, you actually never know what was desired because they scale the project until they get the numbers to work out. So it becomes a hard thing to investigate. But I think just showing how bad these data are should be enough to say that this is not a very good professional standard to be using.
So like clearly it's a bad professional standard, but again, if people are going to fund it in the end are cities and developers, the people who are getting hit the hardest in their wallet,
Right.
might be.
Right. And I did figure out that if half the MPOs in the U.S. spent $4,000 a year in a pooled study, you can collect over 100 data points every year, and you could do it in a controlled way where you're trying to, fill the gaps and control for these things. So you could spend a little bit money up front, commit to a little money up front, and maybe get better results in the end.